This is the second half of Lesson 3 in the JavaEE Web Application Development Series. In the first half of this lesson, we set up a simple page on our client side to allow a user to log in. Now we're going to implement the server side and database to handle the login form. So we've got, again, several different tools and things we're going to be using here. The first thing that we need to do is we have our Maven project here. We need to in lesson 2, we created our MySQL database, but we have not yet linked our Maven project to that MySQL database. So now we need to link our project to the appropriate database. The first thing we need to do is to import a new Maven dependency that's called the MySQL connector. And that is another open source library that's made available that allows us using Java to connect to a MySQL database. So we don't have to handle all of the details of the connection. We can just use these tools that have been written for us. So I'm going to right click on my project here, go to Maven, and select Add Dependency. Now this is going to be updating our pom.xml file that contains all of our dependencies for our project. When we say add dependency, in this text box here in the middle, we can just start typing in the name of the dependency that we want, and it will find it for us. So what we are looking for here is MySQL connector Java. And so this is a package that has been developed um, again to handle our database connection. We click on this one down here. So there are several different versions of this that have been implemented. We actually want to stick with version 5 and not version 6. So the group ID is MySQL. That's who wrote this this package. That's the name of the package. And instead of 6.0.3, change this to 5.1.38. That's the latest version in the version 5 series. So we'll hit OK. And again, Maven will go to work. It's going to bring in all of the jar files and information that we need to handle our communicating with our MySQL database. The next thing that we need to do is tell our application where to go, how to find the database. And we're going to use a tool called JNDI, which is a Java naming package that allows us to create a little XML file that tells our application where our database is, and then it will manage all of that for us. So if we go back to your dev files for lesson 3, you'll see I've created a file here called context.xml. Context.xml is a special file, and we're going to put it in a special folder under web apps called meta-inf. Now this may or may not exist for you. If it does not exist, just simply right click on web app and say new folder, and then it's capital META-INF. These two directories, meta-inf and web-inf, are special directories for Tomcat where certain configuration files are stored. We already saw our web.xml, which contains information about our servlet. We're actually going to be editing that in a moment. But this context.xml file is going to be copied from the files that we've provided for you, and we're going to paste it into meta-inf. So let's take a look at what we've put in here. We're defining a resource here, and our resource in this case is a MySQL database. We're giving it a name, JDBC, which is Java database connection package. That's part of what we just downloaded with that MySQL connector Java. It's a SQL data source. We've got some parameters in here. You don't need to understand all of these right now, but this is going to help us with connection pooling and things like that, we can allow multiple users to be using our web application at the same time. It's going to manage connections for us automatically. If a user isn't active, it will release the connection so somebody else can grab it. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here uh, with this MySQL package. What's important for us right now is the URL. Our our MySQL database is running on localhost port 3306. That is the default for MySQL. And the name of our schema is auction site. Leave that alone. The other things to take note of, we've set it up. We want to connect with a username that's called auction site underscore user, and I've created a password for it, G0 auction with the INO replaced by 1 and 0. So this is our username and password. Now this is stored on the server, and so our, anybody who uses our web application will not have to type in this password or know this password. It's just going to allow us to securely connect to the database. Anybody who's using our web application will connect using this username and password that's stored in context.xml. And down here are just some other parameters that again have to do with pooling and sharing connections. But you can see here's what we're connecting to, and here's the username and password that we are connecting with. We're going to make one more change to our web.xml file. I don't need to make that. I'll have to maximize that. Here's our web XML, and we have our servlet information. I'm going to go ahead and in your lesson 3, there is a web XML file. I'm going to open that with Notepad++. And you can see we're adding a new resource ref. And so this is just basically going to let web XML is going to let our Tomcat server know to go find this resource, and it will find it over in our context.xml. So we're going to copy and paste those resource ref lines in here. You can see I've already done that. So here's our web XML, and then all right. Oops, I don't need that. So we've got our database configured. So now Tomcat, our web application, knows how to connect to our database. We need to do some work now on our the database itself to get that ready. We created this kind of user ID and password, auction site user and go auction. That has not yet been created on our database instance. So I'm launching MySQL Workbench again. We're going to go ahead and we set this MySQL connection up in lesson 2. If you double click on it, it's going to connect to our MySQL instance on our server. And here we are. You can see where we left it last time. We have our auction site schema with the tables that we created. We're going to do some more work here. That user that we defined has not yet been created in this MySQL server. So over here, you'll see there's a users and privileges tab. So we'll click on that. These are the users that get created by default with MySQL. There's a root user, and again, we defined that with our password when we installed MySQL and this system account. What we want to do here is click on Add Account. And we want to create a user called auction site user. That's what we specified in our context.xml. This allows us to define what machines, what servers this user can connect from. This is another security parameter. You can see on these other users, they can only connect from this server. So if I was on a different machine and wanted to access this MySQL instance, I would not be able to connect as root because we've limited it here. This percent basically means I can connect from any server to this MySQL instance. I'm going to leave it for now. When we deploy our final application, we'll probably want to lock that down so that this user can only access the MySQL database from the host that the web application is being hosted on. But for now, we'll leave it. Our password, again, we said was capital G, 0, capital A, U, C, T, 10, N. And we'll do that again, T, 10, N. And then we click down here on apply. So we have now this auction site user that we have created. Now, by default, this auction site user does not have access to this particular schema. So we need to set that up. You may have this query tab open. This just allows us to run SQL statements against this server. If not, you can just click on this plus and it will open up a new query page. I'm going to go ahead and leave this here. We need to run a query here that will allow the user that we just created to access and modify and work with all of the tables on the auction site instance. Again, if you go back to lesson 3, you'll see there's a little file called sql.txt. There are several queries that we're going to run during this lesson, and I've just put them all in here for you so you don't have to type them all. The one that we're interested in right now is this grant query. So we're saying grant all privileges on the auction site schema, all tables on that schema, to auction site user at any host. This is when we log in. If we're logging in from our local host, the user, as far as MySQL is concerned, is auction site user at localhost. So we're saying allow, again, auction site user to connect from any host, any server, and grant all privileges to all tables on the site. This is not where we want to end up with security, but for now this will work for us. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that into this query, and you can hit the little lightning bolt that will execute this statement. And you can see that we have now granted privileges to this user. One other thing, we talked in the first part of this lesson about creating a password hash. And as you saw, that password hash is pretty long. So I'm going to click on our user table here, right click and say alter table. So if you remember last time, we have this table. There's a key field. Our username is 45 characters wide. I already updated this. When we created it, the password field was only 45 characters wide. Our hash is not going to fit in 45 characters. So in this little sql.txt file, I have another little SQL statement that we're going to execute here. So let's copy and paste it in. This says alter table auction site.user, modify the password field, make it a varchar that is 80 characters wide. So we're going to go from 45 characters to 80 characters. If you click on that, you can see that we've modified the table. So using this alter table command, SQL command, you can change column names, column types, column widths, all of those things. Finally, we're going to do one more thing. We're going to create one row in our user table. We want to create a default user. And in this case, I'm going to give it an email address of admin@mail.com, and the password is just password, the hashed version of the word password. And that's what we saw in part 1 of this lesson. I have that particular SQL statement in our sql.txt. So we're going to copy and paste it in here. So what we're doing here is inserting into auction site.user these ID user, username, password, the values. The primary key is 1, here's the username, and here's that hashed password. So we'll run that. That row is created. Now, if you have experience with MySQL databases, you will know that we created the row, but it is not available for other applications to see until we commit that change. So we're going to put a little commit statement in here and execute that. So we've committed that. Now I'm going to run a quick query here. So we're going to do a select star from auction site.user. Let's see what we've got. We now have a user in this table. So we've got our project configured to connect to MySQL. We've got our MySQL database, the user created, and some basic data in here. I'm going to close out these two files. Now, how do we write our server-side code to access our database? Again, in lesson 3, let's start. I've got a Java function that I wrote called dbconnect.java. We're going to copy that. We're going to paste it into the Java com global tech auction site directory. We'll paste that in here. So all of our Java code goes here again. I pasted it in. Sometimes you have to hit refresh to see it. So here's our dbconnect.java. What this is some utilities to connect and disconnect from the database. So when we write our web services, we're going to use these utilities to connect to our database. Let's just walk through this quickly. We're using java.sql library and javax.sql and naming. So I'm creating a new class called dbconnect. I'm going to store our data source. That is basically the database that we are connecting to. And then I've got a logger here that will allow us to log any error messages or anything like that. When I initialize this class, I'm going to pass in this Java naming name. And it's going to go and look it up in our context.xml. So we're going to pass in a name, and it's going to go look it up in the context.xml, figure out how to connect to the database, and then return us this data source object. So this is basically going to be essentially our MySQL database. It's going to go find our MySQL database and give it back to us. And then I am going to, in my servlet call, I'm going to call this method that I wrote called open connection. So basically that is going to set up, it's going to call this database method with this name, JDBC auction site. So it's going to say, go find this resource. Again, in our context.xml, we define this resource with this name. And here is all the information that JNDI needs to find that resource. So now I've got my data source, this private variable is now set with the data source. It will throw an exception if it can't find it. And then once I've got that set up, I can call this get connection method, which is just very simple. It's just calling with your data source, get a connection. If for some reason we're not able to get a connection, so if there are hundreds of users connected to our web application and there are no connections left, this little loop is just basically going to wait for 10 seconds and then try again to get a connection. So I'm going to use this method, open connection, every time I want to connect to the database and get some data from the database or store some data in the database. With these web applications, you basically you don't want to hold a connection open. When you do something, you want to open a connection, do your work, and close that connection. So you'll see here I've also implemented some close methods, and this will allow us to close our connections. And you'll see we've got these statements and result sets, which we'll talk more about in a moment. So this little connection utility package just allows us to write this once, and then each one of our web service calls will use these methods for us. So that's the connection package. And now we're going to implement the actual web service that will manage our check and see if what the user entered on the login form is valid or not. So again, we're going to go to lesson 3, and we're going to go to REST main. This is where all our web services are stored for now. Instead of copying and pasting it, I'm going to open this up in Notepad++. And if actually, I'm going to select it all, copy it, and I'm going to paste it in here. I suppose we could just have copied and pasted it directly into our project. So we've added a whole bunch of stuff here. Again, remember these are our Jersey annotations. I've added several here. Remember before we were saying for a specific web service, it's a get method. Here's the path to it. It's producing text HTML. We're adding some new ones. If you recall in our login.js, we're doing a post instead of a get. So I've added the post annotation. Query parameter, we're not going to use yet. We're going to use that later. Form parameter, this is one. This is a new annotation. When we send form data from the client to the server, remember when we saw in the network traffic, it's sending two pieces of information, the email and the password. And we're going to capture those using form parameters. And then I've added a couple of annotations that we are not using yet, but we will get to. So I've created a new method. The path is login. It's going to produce just plain text again. And here's the function that will get executed when we call auction site / web API / login. Here are the form parameters that we just talked about. We're expecting two form parameters to get passed into this function call. One with the name of email, and we're going to take whatever comes in, whatever data comes in with that name and store it in a variable called email, and another form parameter called password, and we're going to store that in another string called password. So the data will get passed into our function. So let's start here. To start up, we need to define a connection. That's a connection to our data source, a statement, which is our SQL statement, and then a result set, which will return the results of our database query to us. I'm going to wrap everything in a try-catch loop. So if there are any other errors, we can catch them and handle them, report something back, etc., etc., etc. And then I've got this output string that is just what we're going to return back to the user. So we're going to start by calling our little helper method, dbconnect.openConnection. That's the one that I defined over here. Open connection, which looks up our data source, gets a connection. And so we're going to open our connection. Again, if there's an error, it's going to throw it and we'll catch it down here. And then we're going to create a new statement, an SQL statement on this connection. So we're just creating a blank statement. There's several things we can do with the statement. Right now, we're just going to do the simplest thing, which is called execute query. So I can say statement, execute query, and here's our SQL query. Select password from auctionsite.user, where username equals, and then whatever was passed into this function. And the results of that query are going to get returned in this result set. So we expect this result set to have one row in it. If it can't find this username, the result set will have no rows. So basically I'm saying if result set.next, if there's a row in our result set, let's do some processing. If not, I'm going to set output to no user. That means we didn't find this username in our database. If we did find a user, we're going to say result set get string password. What was in the password field that we were asking about, and then set this variable db password. So now this is the password that's stored in the database. We also have the password that was sent in to us from the web form, we're going to see if they match. If the password from our web form equals the password stored in the database, we're going to say OK. If not, we're going to say nope, bad password. So basically, we're just getting the password from the database, and then we're going to send back basically a message to our web page, either OK, bad password, no user, or if this is blank, we know that something wrong, something happened with our opening our database connection or something to that effect. In this finally block, then we're going to make sure to close our connection. As I said, we don't want to keep connections hanging open. We just want to hit the database and then get out of the way so other users can use it. We close our result set, we close our statement, and then we close our connection. So that is basically the gist of what we need to do to handle our request from our form. So we've got everything in place. Theoretically, we should be up and running. I'm going to go ahead and restart our server. So we'll start our server. So come up here, get everything up and running. And just takes a few seconds, and we've got our server running now. Let's go back to our login page, localhost 8080 auction site, login.html. I'm going to reload this page. So let's start by putting in a user that doesn't exist. So steve@test.com, password hello. Let me hit the login button. It says it could not find that email address in our system. Let's go back. I did one more thing we need to talk about here. Remember, we have our login.js function. I've actually updated that. We have a new, put that out in lesson 3, login.js, edit with Notepad++. So we had this very simple login success function. I've copied it in here. So some data is going to come back from the server, and we're expecting, if the data that comes back from the server is okay, you can see here, if the passwords match, the output is okay, then, in our login result div, we're going to write you are now logged in. If the data that comes back says no user, we're going to put this, could not find that email address in our system. If the data that comes back is bad pass, we'll tell the user that's the incorrect password. If we get anything else, we're just going to say login failed. So as you can see, I entered an email address that doesn't exist, and the message that I got back says, I could not find that email address in our system. Oh, okay. Oh, wrong email address. So let's try admin@mail.com. That one does exist in the system. I'm going to put in the wrong password. I'm going to type in hello. Let's see. Oh, it's telling me that's the incorrect password. Well, let's try the correct password. PASSWORD. And you are now logged in. So we are going out to the server, we're getting the password, we're checking to see if it matches, and then getting the data back to the web page. So we now basically have a fully functioning, very simple form, sending data to the server, connecting to the database, getting data from the database, and checking it. One more thing I want to show you before we finish for today. We know how to debug our client code. We can use these developer tools, more tools, developer tools. We can see all of our JavaScript code and can set a breakpoint and do all of that. But what if we want to debug something on the server? What if I want to debug this method, the validate login method? Actually, that's really simple to do as well, as long as we're all running on one machine here. All we have to do is go back to the server tab, right-click on our server, and say restart in debug. So it's basically going to start our Tomcat server in debug mode. And what will happen here, the server is going to come up, and the server is started. Now I can set a breakpoint anywhere in my Java code. You can click over here just to the left of a line, and it should set a breakpoint. Otherwise, you can right-click, say toggle breakpoint. So there's a breakpoint set here at the first line of validate login. So now let's hit the login button. This is going to call that web method again. So I'll click that. Oh, Tomcat says, oh, I want to launch the debugger, and basically it's just saying, do you want to go ahead and go into debug mode here? I'm going to say yes. So now we're in debug mode in Tomcat. You see up here on the top right, JavaEE, that is our normal perspective, and we just switched over to a debug perspective. So you can see our call stack and our variables and everything. So here is the code that we are stepping through right here. Let's look at this. We got these two form parameters that came in. Email, if I just hover over it, email is set to admin@mail.com, and password is that long hash. So those parameters are getting passed in correctly, and then we can just do our normal stepping. So I can step over, step over, step over. So again, you can go through here and see everything that is happening, and debug through that if you need to. And then I'm just going to let this fly. So that is how you can debug the Java, the server-side code. I can hit stop to, that will terminate our server. I'm just going to flip back to the other perspective. So this is kind of our coding perspective. This is still up and running in debug mode. So every time I submit that form, it will try to flip me back into debug mode. If I don't want to do that, if I'm done with debugging, I can stop this and then flip back. You can see my server is stopped. So when you start the server, you can either start it or start it in debug mode. So that is the basics of the client side and the server side login screen. The next time we will walk through more advanced forms and other topics.